says he is. Told together from Eckert. Told together from Eckert. You need a thesis statement. You need a thesis statement.
Welcome back. In this next segment, we're going to talk about grammar, which is, of course, the subject you're all dying to learn more about. And it's true that grammar is the best way to get girls. There's nothing that attracts women like knowing the difference between further and farther. And I can say from experience that the wildest parties I've ever been to were ones where English majors discussed split infinitives. Okay, well, to be serious, none of this is true. Nobody really likes grammar except strange people like me. And English is a difficult language. It's, I think, a language that's very easy to learn the basics of, but a language that is impossible to master. It's not a pure language the way some of the Asian languages are, which have a fairly straight descent from one linguistic ancestor to another. English is not the good girl who stayed home Saturday night. English is the bad girl who had affairs with Latin, French, and German. Or more technically, English is a German girl who had affairs with French and Latin. English is a Germanic language. It is not a Latinate language, although it is heavily influenced by those languages. And the upshot of that is that English has an extremely complex grammar because it's borrowed verb tenses, grammatical formations, ways of doing things from many different language systems. Why is it important to get grammar right? And that seems like a very obvious question, and the obvious answer is because your teacher says so. Surely we can come up with a more fundamental reason why grammar is important other than being simply anal and saying it's important to do things right the way your father told you. The reason that grammar is extremely important to get right in an academic paper is, I think, two reasons. One is that you're talking about difficult subjects. When I'm giving you these little examples in these video tutorials, we're using funny or juvenile examples like sports cars. In the real world, you're going to be writing about protein folding, you're going to be writing about foreign affairs, you're going to be writing about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you're going to be writing about difficult subjects relating to abstract topics. If you do not write clearly and your sentences do not make sense, the reader is going to get lost. If your subject is difficult and there's the added problem or the added disadvantage that your sentences are difficult to understand, many readers are simply going to give up. You don't want that. You want your readers to be curious. You want them to be interested in what you're writing. You want them to keep going. The second reason that grammar is very important in academic writing particularly is the matter of credibility. It's a cruel world, right? If you do not write clear sentences, if your sentences do not make grammatical sense, your reader is going to think you're an idiot. And maybe you have brilliant ideas, maybe your ideas are well argued with solid evidence and excellent argumentation. It doesn't matter what kind of content you have in your papers. If the grammar doesn't make sense, the paper's going to fall down. This segment I'm going to aim mostly at native speakers, and what I mean by those people are people who've grown up speaking English. And I think the biggest psychological hurdle I have in teaching native speakers of English is that because you know how to speak English very well does not mean that you know how to write English very well. There is a certain amount of content or a certain skill set that's involved in writing English, and so you need to jump that psychological hurdle of saying, I know how to do this because I can speak English. They're not the same. Every language has a sort of gap between the spoken form of the language and the written form of the language. In English's case, it's quite large. You can get away with things in spoken English that you cannot in written English, partly because When I speak to you in a conversation, you can see me. You can see my hands move. You can see the expression on my face. You know whether I'm being serious or silly or playful or sarcastic or angry. You can tell a lot about what I'm telling you without even listening to my words. If you watch a foreign film on television and there's no subtitles, often you can understand some of what's going on just by looking at body language. With writing, you don't have that. And so that's part of the problem with the difference between spoken English and written English, is that you don't have body language. Having said that, there are also simply conventions that people use in written English that they don't use in spoken English. We're dealing with academic writing, so there's an expectation of tone and complexity that you would not find in spoken English. Okay. What are the most common problems that I see in native speakers when they write English? And I guess to simply repeat what I've just been talking about, the basic problem that I get with native speakers is that they write as they hear. They write down the way that they hear English. A good example, students will write should have. The correct English is should have. You should have done your homework. You should have paid your taxes. Often native speakers will simply say should have, because that's what it sounds like in conversational English. It's not how you write. Similarly, than and then. Spain has a warmer climate than Iceland. Okay, that is a than word, that's a comparison. A is better than B. That's different from then as a sequence or time marker. I was at the library, then I went to the supermarket, then I went home. Because those words sound the same in spoken English to a native speaker, there's a tendency to get them confused. The third thing that native speakers have problems with is that they tend to use commas in written English the way they would use them in spoken English. They use commas as pauses. I was doing this, then I was doing that, then she said this, then he said that. Now, often people in written English, they will add in commas to indicate those pauses. That's fine in an email, that's fine in a text message, it's not fine in academic writing, where the comma has a specific function, and that is to separate elements of a sentence, or separate logical components of a sentence, such as items in a list. Because commas are so abused in written English by most speakers, let's take an in-depth look at them. Again, avoid using commas simply as pauses. There are 4 main uses for the comma. One is to make lists. After the flood, there were broken dishes, lost cutlery, and damaged carpets. That last comma, which indicates the end of the series, is called the Oxford comma. Some writers, such as journalists, omit it. If you're going to leave it out, make sure that the sentence doesn't become confusing or misleading as a result. The second use of the comma is to make introductory phrases or clauses. Setting off introductory words with a comma lets the reader know that the main subject and main verb of the sentence come later. No matter what size it is, an introductory bit cannot stand alone as a complete thought. The third use of commas is to make links or conjunctions. If the second part of the sentence is not a complete thought, you do not need a comma. Often it can simply be omitted. But if you join 2 sentence parts with a conjunction and comma, make sure you avoid writing a comma splice, which is 2 complete sentences joined with a comma. One way to fix this is to make the comma a period. A second way is to add a conjunction such as and. A special word which often causes comma splices is however. Basketball is my favorite sport, however pizza eating is where I excel. Here's a case where people write the way they hear it spoken, but that comma does not belong there. Again, replace it with a period,
replace it with a conjunction, or replace it with a semicolon. That last mark is a semicolon, which is often used in place of a period to link together two related sentences. Don't confuse the semicolon with a colon, which is mostly used to signal a list. The last chief use of commas is to insert information, what we would also call a non-restrictive clause. 2 commas can be used to set off additional information that appears within the sentence. You should be able to take out the section framed by commas and still have a complete and clear sentence.
Okay. Other things that native speakers do, they tend to be more stylistic rather than simple mechanical errors. One category of errors is that native speakers will use contractions. Generally, you don't use contractions in academic writing. The other thing native speakers often do is that they use I far too much in academic writing. That is reflecting conversation, which tends to be egocentric. You're telling a story to your friend, I did this and I did this, I think this is my opinion. Generally, we avoid I in academic writing. It is usable in certain situations, which I'll talk about. But those are really things you want to avoid if you're a native speaker of English. Another key difference that we should speak about, which differentiates spoken English from written English, is that written English tends to have a much more precise use of verb tenses. There is a much more accurate sense of when things happen. This again reflects the nature that when you're speaking in English, the context makes time relationships clear, and my body language helps make things clear. You don't have that in written English. Grammar is related to the idea of typography. It's not exactly the same thing, but they overlap. Part of the idea of having your readers build confidence or retain confidence in your ability to speak to them is typography. And what that means is using correct formats. You might use APA format, American Psychological Association, for your title pages and page typography. You might use MLA, Modern Languages Association, or Chicago, or some other variation based on whatever discipline you're writing in. Your title pages, the way you format, your spacing, indentation, they are all going to be affected by those style standards. And so part of grammar writing, or I guess the cousin of grammar, is typography, having a correct layout on the page. Now, some of these things ought to be obvious. You give somebody a paper and the paper is dirty. You have a giant fat staple in the middle preventing people from taking apart the pages. Things like that are going to detract from the readability of your paper and detract from your reader's confidence in what you're trying to tell them. Another obvious example, I get students who try to use gigantic fonts. They're asked to use an 11 or 12 point Times New Roman font, which is generally the standard for academia. They use Comic Sans or some ridiculous looking font, or they run out of things to say. They're asked to write 5 pages. They type 3 pages and then think, okay, I'll just use 18 point fonts. You insult the reader when you do that, because the reader knows what you're trying to do. You're trying to pad out the paper to compensate for the fact that you don't have very much to say. So that is something you want to avoid. All right, well, that's all I have to say in this segment about the typical problems native speakers have with written academic English. Again, all of these things are not going to make you the life of the party, but they will make your written English much stronger and much more readable. Remember the holy grail of academic writing, which is clarity. Well-written sentences that are easily understood are going to be much more convincing to your reader. They're going to help your reader understand your arguments and convince them of your arguments much more effectively.